Attila, a central figure in the turbulent landscape of the 5th century, was a formidable leader. He is probably the reason why we know the Huns as more than just marauders. Huns, the people who only a few decades back had been considered only as bands of fierce and warlike people, came under Attila's leadership, and then he turned them into a full-fledged empire expanding across a vast area, whose impact would go on to reverberate across both the Eastern and the Western Roman Empire. His campaigns and diplomatic maneuvering would reshape the geopolitical dynamics of his time. The Scourge of God, as he became known, was more than just a mere man to the Huns. As a possessor of the sword of the ancient age, he proclaimed himself as a chosen one by their gods. Attila, who was more than just a capable military leader, when he associated himself with the legends, he became a man who would be seen as somewhat equal to gods. And this is what made Attila different from other Hunnic leaders. As a result of this, he received an absolute loyalty from his followers. And he would exploit this loyalty to make history. Attila the Hun was no son of the steppes. He was probably born at the beginning of the 5th century, somewhere on the great Hungarian plain. His father Mundzuk was one of the brothers of Octar and Rua, joint leaders of the Huns in the later 420s and 430s. His family being one of the most powerful of all the Huns, he had quite a privileged upbringing. And clearly not the homeless half-starved barbarian child of Ammianus Marcellinus's imagination. The young Attila spent most of his time in the company of his elder brother Bleda. They were taught all the necessary skills such as archery, sword fighting, lasso, horse riding, and also military and diplomatic tactics. They were also likely to have been taught multiple languages, for conducting business as well as for controlling subjugated people. After the sudden death of his uncle Rua while on a campaign, his two nephews, Bleda and Attila, took his position. They inherited an empire established by military forces, whose stability could not always be guaranteed. During their migration towards Europe, the Huns had to fight several battles to get to where they were now. Owing to their superior horsemanship and better military tactics, they had defeated and subjugated many people groups. Octar and Rua's efforts to strengthen the Huns' hold over Central Europe were continued by Attila and Bleda. Attila and Bleda also promoted the consolidation of the Hun rule. As suggested by historians, the regular payment of the tribute was made possible due to the cooperation of the locally powerful leaders. Some of these subjugated leaders acted out of fear, and others out of self-interest. But Attila and Bleda allowed these collaborators to retain control over their own affairs, and welcomed them as their companions. After successful raids, these leaders were allotted a share of the spoils as trustworthy subordinates. Allowing such wealth to be distributed to these leaders of the subject peoples was perhaps one of the keys to the success of their empire. It would be wrong to think of the Huns at this point as grabbing all of the gold for themselves. Nor did they seek to dominate the local leaders by threats and violence alone. Attila knew the benefits of collaborating with these leaders. As for these leaders, it might have proved much more profitable to fight alongside Attila and Bleda than to seek asylum among the Romans. In contrast to the Roman Empire, where each emperor had a responsibility to support the Church and all who followed its teaching, and to discourage the heretics and unbelievers from worshipping their false gods, the Huns under Attila promoted state-sponsored religion, and this served as one of the engines of the empire. So Attila and Bleda rose to power in the year 434, shortly after the sudden death of his uncle Rua while on a campaign. In the year 435, Bleda and Attila signed their first peace treaty with the East Romans, in the city of Margus. The agreement was that Romans were not to receive any further fugitives from Huns' dominions, and to return those that had been admitted. They were to send back escaped Roman prisoners, or pay 8 solidi for each. Romans were not to make an alliance with the Huns' enemy. Huns were to be given trading rights in certain market towns. The annual tribute, which was previously 350, now doubled to 700 libra of gold per annum. On these conditions, the Roman government signed what we may call the Peace of Margus, in the year 435. Before Attila and Bleda, Rua had a good relationship with Aetius, a Roman general of the Western Empire. Until now, he had twice received help from the Huns in the form of military, to push his own political agendas. In the year 435, he again turned to the Huns, hoping that these new rulers might commit troops to a campaign in the west. Aetius managed to get the Hun troops, and in return, conceded a broad belt of land about 100 miles wide, facing the Danube. This alliance of Romans and the Huns was an overwhelming success. In 436, the Burgundians, who had once defeated Actor while on his expansionist adventure, were defeated by these allied forces and the truce was agreed. But the next year, the Burgundians were wiped out by the Huns. In this act of ethnic cleansing, more than 20,000 men, women, and children were said to have been butchered. And Roman commanders didn't prevent this slaughter. It was a bloody price for a joint expedition. At the same time, Hun and Roman troops under Litorius, one of Aetius's senior officers, moved west and defeated the Bigoti into submission. Litorius then turned south to deal with the Goths. In 436, while the Huns and Romans were busy fighting the Burgundians, the Goths took the opportunity to attack Narbo, a prosperous Mediterranean port at the mouth of River Aude, standing at the intersection of the two great highways. The Goths had blockaded the town to starve the people into submission. The arrival of the Litorius's troops in later 437 broke the siege. The following year, both Aetius and Litorius continued to press the Goths. In 439, while Litorius was instructed to campaign alone, he reached Toulouse. There the battle turned against him, and he was captured. By nightfall, all the Huns were routed, and a few days later, Litorius was executed. As for Attila himself, we have no idea of what he was up to in the year between 435 and 439. Historians suggest that he went on subduing the nations in Scythia, and made war upon the Saraceni. It seems he extended his frontiers in these years, to the limits which they finally attained. It was during this period that Attila reached as far north as the islands in the ocean. Historians now agree that the islands ruled by Attila were those of the Baltic Sea. In the year 439, the same year when Litorius was defeated with the Hun troops and killed, Emperor Theodosius ratified the treaty, which was negotiated in 435 in the Margus, but did so with little intention of carrying out its terms, although he made a show of doing so. He soon surrendered the refugees they had in custody, among them 2 boys of Attila's own family. Yet Theodosius seems to have omitted to pay the 700 libras of gold in the years that followed, and he found fugitive tribes far too valuable as soldiers in his army to send them back to their master. A few weeks after the peace was renegotiated, on the October 19, 439, Vandals led by Gaiseric seized Carthage in direct violation of the treaty agreed in the year 435. And as predicted, soon after capturing Carthage, the Vandals' army set sail for Sicily. Vandals' army, if decided to move eastward along the African coast, could split Egypt off from the empire. The great commercial harbor of Alexandria might be blockaded, disrupting the shipments of grain on which Constantinople depended. Therefore, quick military actions were needed. Theodosius believed that his treaty with Attila and Bleda would hold, and so he released the units from the Danube defense and put them in the task force. Led by 3 capable generals, Flavius Ariobindus, Ancilla, and Germanus, the army set sail from Constantinople in the spring of 440. As soon as Attila and Bleda received the news that the fleet had left for Sicily, they opened their Danube offensive. Given the recent loss of Toulouse, the brothers had been reluctant to cross the border, while the Roman army was at full strength. But now the situation was to their advantage, and so they opened their offensive against the Romans. The first attack was on Constantia, across the river from Margus. This was the place where both sides had agreed to facilitate cross-border commerce. On a crowded market day, the Huns struck without warning, easily taking the town in a carefully coordinated attack on its Roman garrison. Theodosius, surprised by this attack, sends Flavius Aspar as his envoy to arrange a truce, and to investigate the reasons for the Huns' breach of the peace. When Aspar reached the frontier, he found out that Attila had regarded the treaty as void. Attila argued that it had already been broken by the Roman authorities at Margum. The town's bishop was alleged to have crossed the Danube at night, to steal valuable articles from Hun tombs. Even more seriously, he was said to have desecrated burials belonging to members of Attila and Bleda's own family. Attila demanded that the tomb-raiding bishop of Margum be handed over, along with other refugees who were offered protection, which was against the treaty. Aspar's failure to hand over the bishop of Margum and the refugees was the only confirmation that he needed to take the treaty as no longer in force. In the next 9 months, the Huns attacked, captured, and destroyed almost all the major cities in the middle of the Danube, and southeast along the Morava River valley. The names of the places besieged and sacked were Sirmium, Singidunum, Margum, Viminatium, Nisus, and Sardica. Of the hundreds of unfortified settlements that must also have been plundered and set on fire, there is no record, not even a name. They gained their first major success when the great city of Viminatium fell into their hand. It was razed to the ground. Procopius a century later simply says that the old city of Viminatium stood there, but long ago it was destroyed from the very bottom of its foundation. For 100 years the site was desolate, until Justinian rebuilt it. At Margum, the citizens debated how to handle the situation. Aspar had left the city once Attila had rejected the negotiation. The bishop, in fear that he might be handed over to the Huns, slipped out of the city, crossed the river, and offered to betray the town to the Huns, in return for his guaranteed safety. Attila accepted, and hence the inevitable followed, the slaughter of all the defenders and the destruction of Margum. But not every city fell through treachery. Attila's success also lay in his army's skill at siege warfare. Attila had made sure that the Huns mastered siege technology, and were able to attack and capture fortified cities. Singidunum was razed to the ground, and like Viminatium, was left utterly desolate until the days of Justinian. The worst calamity of all was the loss of the vitally important city of Sirmium, the hinge upon which the defense of the whole Danube frontier turned. Sirmium was destroyed and its inhabitants enslaved. With the capture of Sirmium, the campaign of 441 came to an end. Nevertheless, the season's achievement had been immense. An enormous gap had been broken in the fortification of the Danube frontier. Throughout this campaign, Attila had met with no opposition from the Roman field army. The reason was, of course, that he had chosen his time so well, when the campaign in Persia and the central Mediterranean had absorbed all the available Roman forces. The fleet returned to Constantinople in the spring of 442. Theodosius now felt himself capable once again. And so when Attila demanded the fugitives and tribute money when the next campaigning season came around, Theodosius' ministers refused to hand over the fugitives, whom they had enrolled among the imperial forces. Instead, they decided to send envoys to reach an agreement. Attila, in anger after hearing the emperor's reply, began to devastate the Roman territory opposite him, and driving eastwards along the Danube, captured a few forts of minor importance, and then took the great and populous city of Ratiaria on the right bank of the Danube. This city was a base of the Danube fleet and contained one of the arms factories. It was utterly destroyed, and the inhabitants carried off as slaves into the dominions of the Huns. Then they came up to the city of Nisus. It was a strategically important city having an imperial arms factory, and was thickly populated. As the Huns rode away from this city, it lay desolate like all others. When Philippopolis fell into their hands, the defense of the European provinces was almost impossible, because it was at this city where the two most important roads crossed each other. Adrianople and Heraclea either beat off their attacks or were bypassed, but Arcadiopolis was taken. The booty was enormous and the number of prisoners was beyond counting. At last, they met the new army of Theodosius. It was commanded by Aspar, Germanus, and Arnegisclus, but they were no match for Attila. They engaged in a succession of battles outside the capital, but suffered heavy defeats in them all, and were cut off from Constantinople and forced back into Chersonesus. It was hopeless for the Hun to attack the new fortifications of Constantinople, and so no moves were made against the capital itself. Instead, Attila pursued the remnant of Aspar's army in the Chersonesus, and shattered the remaining forces of the Romans there. The only success won by the empire was at the town of Assamus, but this was purely a local success and not been due to the regular army. A large squadron of Huns who were detached from the main body to invade Lower Moesia were handicapped by the weight of their booty and captives. The men of Assamus suddenly fell upon them, and although outnumbered, the citizens succeeded in killing a considerable number of enemies with slight losses, and rescued the Roman prisoners. After the defeat in the Chersonesus, Theodosius again begged for the terms. Attila agreed to negotiate, but the terms were harsh. The fugitives were handed over at once. Arrears of tribute calculated 6,000 libras of gold. Annual tribute now trebled to 2,100 libras of gold per annum, and escaped prisoners to be ransomed at 12 solidi per head. When the Huns came to the eastern capital to receive the gold and the fugitive, they added that the men of Assamus were to be surrendered together with all their prisoners, whether Roman or barbarian, otherwise treaty would not be ratified. Romans did attempt to persuade to let go of this demand, but found out the complete willingness of Attila to continue the war. But the rescued Romans at Assamus were already dispersed to their homes, and they had already massacred the Hun that they had captured, except for the two that were kept for ransom. So they returned the two, and the first peace of Anatolius was ratified in the autumn of 443. Later Attila sent embassies one after another, each time with several small complaints. On each occasion, Theodosius's ministers presented the envoys with the handsome gifts, which it was customary to bestow on ambassadors. Attila probably sent these embassies, so that his followers might reap the harvest of rich and costly presents. After the conclusion of the Peace of Anatolius, the plans and movements of the Huns are exceedingly obscure, because the relevant portion of Priscus' work has not survived. At some point after the campaign, Attila decided to challenge Bleda. Unfortunately, we have no idea how they came to become rivals. Only one thing is sure, that in the year around 445, Bleda, king of the Huns, was assassinated as a result of the plots of his brother Attila. And so the people governed by Bleda now came under the direct control of Attila. From 445 until his death, he had no rival among the Huns. He found it necessary, however, to base his supremacy on the foundation of his followers' superstition. And for this purpose, he had to use an old sword that had recently been discovered by one of his followers. It was the sword of the war god, he declared. Anyone who questioned his right to unite the position of Bleda with his own would have to fight not only himself, but the divine powers as well. Toward the end of 446, Attila sent diplomatic letters to the imperial court, demanding the people who had fled across the Danube be handed over, along with the back payment of the annual tribute. Theodosius, confident that he could contain any Hun attack, refused to hand over both the money and the refugees. Attila, who was now at the height of his career, launched his second invasion in the spring of 447. The assault was directed farther to the east than in 441. They started by taking Roman forts along the frontier, including Ratiaria. As the Hun squadrons moved forward, a disaster of the first magnitude befell the Romans. A series of earthquakes began on January 447. It caused a grievous loss to the Romans. Entire villages were swallowed up, countless disasters both on land and sea. Hillocks were leveled with the ground, countless buildings were thrown down in Constantinople, and worst of all, a stretch of the massive wall, including no less than 57 towers, fell to the ground. Many inhabitants were buried under the ruins of numerous collapsed buildings. That plague soon made its appearance again, and thousands of the citizens died. It seemed as if only a miracle could save Constantinople. So the miracle was made to happen by Flavius Constantinus. Under his direction, the wall was restored in its entirety within 60 days of calamity. Not content with merely that, he also built a second wall in front of it. After taking Ratiaria, the Huns had moved to attack the major cities and forts that stood between them and Constantinople. Many soldiers and cities were repeatedly sacrificed to obtain the time required to build the walls of Constantinople. The most prominent of cities destroyed during the Huns' march toward Constantinople were Philippopolis, Arcadiopolis, Callipolis, Cestus, and Athyras. The Huns came as close as Athyras, but never saw Theodosian walls. The disease and its surroundings, as well as the certainty that it would be a long siege, discouraged Attila from even attempting to take Constantinople. The Huns therefore moved back north, towards Marcinople. Roman forces under Arnagisclus blocked the Huns' homeward march. In a long and exhausting engagement, both armies suffered heavy casualties. Arnagisclus fought bravely until his death, but the Huns gained the upper hand. The result of this battle was the fall of Marcinople, and it lay desolate until Justinian restored it a century later. Despite this heroic last stand, the Huns' Danube offensive was a devastating success. Count Marcellinus writes with a vigor which he rarely displays elsewhere. He writes, "Attila ground almost the whole of Europe into the dust." What followed next was a negotiation of peace. Apart from the usual return of the refugee or payment for each of them, it's not clear how much was the yearly tribute fixed. But we know that Attila demanded the evacuation of a broad belt of territory, running from Singidunum, eastward along the river to Novi, and 5 days' journey wide. For many contemporaries, the peace settlement was an outright humiliation. Priscus of Panium writes, "Because of the overwhelming terror that gripped their generals, the Romans were compelled to accept cheerfully every injunction, no matter how harsh, in their eagerness for peace. Whatever the amount, it is clear that it was a huge sum." In the season that followed, Huns are found engaged with an obscure people called Acatziri. We precisely do not know who these people were and where they lived. We have a general idea that they were nomads, living off their flocks and herds, and by hunting. Theodosius, realizing their strategic importance, sends gifts to them. Roman envoys, unaware of their true leaders, presented the gifts to the wrong leader. Quiriticus, their main leader, in fear that he was being deposed from his position, turned in anger to Attila. Attila, without any delay, sends the required forces, and after a succession of battles, he reduced the whole race to subjection. He left Quiriticus to rule his particular tribe, but Attila sent his eldest son to rule the rest of the Acatziri. And Theodosius's attempt to win friends in the rear of Attila was thus unsuccessful. In the spring of 449, Edico, a close companion as well as a bodyguard of Attila, arrived in Constantinople. Theodosius, through Chrysaphius, the commander of the imperial bodyguard, tried to bribe Edico to kill Attila for a huge amount of gold and lavish lifestyle. And so in the early summer of 449, envoys were sent to Attila to go along with Edico, on cover of which the murder of Attila was to be carried out. Priscus, unaware of this plot, also accompanied this envoy. This journey could be read in Priscus' account in detail. But long story short, the plot was a complete failure. Attila in anger demanded that a person responsible for the plot be handed over to him. In the spring of 450, Anatolius and Nomus set out to bring down the anger of Attila. Presented with their rich gifts and soft words, Attila was calmed down. This was a resounding diplomatic success. On top of this, the ambassadors even persuaded Attila to retire from the strips south of the Danube, which in the year 448 had been ordered to evacuate. Towards the west, Aetius, the commander of the Western Roman Empire, has had a good relationship with Attila. There had been several occasions when Attila had provided Aetius with the Hunnic troops. And sometime around the 440s, Aetius had persuaded Valentinian to give the honorary rank of general to Attila. But since the defeat of Huns troops under Litorius, there had been no further help to Aetius from Attila. And the relationship between Aetius and Attila is obscure in the years that followed. In 448, after Aetius had crushed the latest uprising, a prominent leader of the Bugatti flees to the Huns as a refugee. Again in 449, there was an argument between the Western Empire and Attila regarding the claim of golden bulls. This is a sure indication that the relationship was not as smooth as it used to be. In the early month of 450, Attila announced that he was about to attack the Visigothic kingdom centered around Toulouse, and intended to do so as Valentinian's ally. Shortly before the spring of 450, Gaiseric and Vandal Africa had been instigating him to undertake a campaign against the Visigoths. But the idea was there in Attila's mind even before this. And so, having formed his plan to attack, he assured Valentinian that the campaign was aimed at Visigoths alone. At the same time, he directed Theodoric, the king of Visigoths, to denounce the treaty with Western Roman Empire. Then came to Attila a message from Justigrada Honoria, the sister of Valentinian. The princess, being forcibly engaged to a wealthy senator, sent a messenger to Attila for a rescue, and for assurance she sent her ring. Attila took this as a proposal, and proclaimed Honoria as his wife. On the 28th of July 450, Emperor Theodosius died, and on the 25th of August, Marcian was crowned Emperor of the East. Marcian soon changed the policy towards the Huns. He announced that no tribute would be sent to the Huns anymore. Faced with such a situation, Attila dispatched 2 embassies, one to Ravenna and one to Constantinople. The Western government was informed that Honoria was her bride, and half of the Western Empire was to be given to her as her inheritance. To the one sent to East was to direct Marcian to resume payment of the tribute. Both the embassies were a failed attempt. Towards the end of the year, yet another complication arose. King of the Ripuarian Franks had died recently, and quarrel had broken out among his sons. The elder had appealed to Attila for alliance, while the younger had to Aetius. Aetius went on to adopt the prince as his son. Now it was clear that Aetius and the Western government were in open breach with the Huns, and were seeking allies wherever they could find them. So what was then a campaign against the Visigoths, now involved the Franks as well. As the Hun army began the march, Attila dispatched another ambassador to Valentinian, instructing him to prepare a palace for him. Aetius, realizing that this was a full-scale war against the Western Empire, went to Theodoric, the king of Visigoths, to join forces with a man he had been fighting for a long time. But they eventually made an alliance. Many cities fell to Attila as he crossed the Rhine. On the 7th of April, Metz fell to Attila, then he made for Orleans. Aetius and Theodoric hurriedly marched to seize Orleans before Attila could reach it. To their surprise, the Huns had besieged the place and entered it. But the arrival of Aetius and Theodoric saved Orleans from destruction. Exactly how they managed to force the Huns out, we do not know. The Huns withdrew to the east, retreating to a place that was then called the Catalaunian Plains. The two armies met somewhere on this plain. On one side stood Romans under Aetius, together with the Goths under Theodoric and his son Thorismid. They were reinforced by the units from the Burgundians and the Bugatti, both of which had an ambiguous relationship with the Western Empire. Fighting alongside the Huns were troops that Jordan says, the countless peoples and various nations that Attila had brought under his control. Most important were the Goths, who had remained north of the Danube. This fight was not just about the Huns and the Romans, nor the end of a lifelong friendship between Aetius and Attila, but also about the division that separated two groups of the Goths with sharply opposing histories. Two armies eventually clashed. The battle was fierce. The Gothic king Theodoric was among the slain. In the end, Attila retreated into the circle of wagons that he had drawn up behind him. The Goths wanted to resume the struggle and blockade Attila, to starve him out. The chances of success were bright, and the Huns might in fact be utterly destroyed. But for some reason, Aetius persuades both Thorismund and the young Frankish king to return home, and allows Attila to retreat. Towards the east, despite Hun's threatening embassy, Marcian had persisted in his resolution not to pay Theodosius's tribute. And so in September 451, Attila sends a small band of Huns to launch a plundering raid upon eastern Illyricum. The plundering band was probably a small one, but Marcian himself decided to take the field against it in person. Whatever the outcome, he was very pleased with the result. In the summer of 452, the Hun army mobilized once again. Attila made a sudden and rapid march through Hungary and Slovenia, and straight into Italy. Attila at last was coming for his bride Honoria. Attila's first objective was Aquileia. It did not fall as quickly as some of the fortified cities south of the Danube. After a long siege, the Huns massacred the inhabitants and razed the city to the ground, from which it never rose again. As they rode southwards, Concordia and Altinum fell before them. Their next conquest was Patavium. All these cities were burnt, and all their inhabitants were led away into slavery, as they were too terrified to resist. Turning westwards, they stormed Vaesia, Verona, Brixia, and Bergamo and then arrived at Milan. Both Milan and Ticinum were taken, but for some reason, were not plundered nor were the citizens massacred. In the later summer of 452, just outside the city of Mantua, Attila received an embassy sent by Valentinian from Rome, and this delegation was headed by Pope Leo I. This confrontation is most dramatically presented in one of the brilliant frescoes painted by Raphael. After Attila concluded peace, he left Italy. While Attila was still in Italy, Marcian had seen and grasped his opportunity. East Roman force crossed the Danube and routed the Hun force, which had been left behind to safeguard their territories. Attila, hard pressed by both human and natural forces, retired from Italy, without ever fighting Marcian. Before the campaigning season of 453 came around, the first thing Attila did was to send out a message to Marcian that he was about to make war upon the Eastern Empire and enslave its inhabitants. Before the campaigning season began, he decided to add another to the long series of his wives. After the wedding, Attila drank far into the night. The next day he did not come out from his room. His servants eventually forced an entry, and they found their master dead, and his bride weeping beside him. Attila had bled through the nose during the night, and being heavily drunk, had been suffocated in his sleep. And this is how the greatest of Hun kings came to an end. If the society of the Huns had been as it was at the time of their arrival in the 4th century, the Huns would not have been able to rear up such a vast empire in the 5th century. As is the case with every society, the Hun society did not remain stationary either. As wealth grew, kingship made its appearance among them. This accumulation of wealth also then began to shape the Hunnic society as a whole. From the time of Rua, we see the Huns demanding tribute from the Romans. It was 350 libras of gold per annum, then it was increased to 700 libras per annum, and again increased to 2,100 libras per annum. As early as the days of Ulden, the Huns sold off their prisoners at 1 solidi a head. In 435, it was 8 solidi per head, and then it was raised to 12 solidi per head in 443. This money of the prisoners was to go to those who had captured the prisoners. But the tribute money was to be paid directly to Bleda and Attila after the year 445. The booty captured was not distributed evenly to all the Huns. The most powerful of them received a large share of the booty. Apart from all these, the Huns obtained an enormous quantity of plunder during their raids. The family of Attila had successfully made the military leadership a hereditary office, being held by successive generations, which was completely different from the primates from Ammianus's description. In this new system of government, there was no room for primates anymore. Instead, there were other leaders who ranked directly below Attila. These leaders were sent on diplomatic missions on various occasions. They were also called upon to guard Attila himself. Each of these leaders was assigned a military force of his own. With these militaries, each one ruled over a specific portion of the great empire. During campaigns, these leaders not only commanded the Hun squadrons, but also the warriors of the subject peoples assigned to them. However, the loyalty of the forces assigned to these leaders was laid to Attila, and not to these leaders. Apart from keeping order among the subject nations, they also had a duty to collect tribute and foodstuffs from them. Huns who despised agriculture depended on their subjects' produce for food. Huns were rigorous in their collection of food. Whether their subjects produced enough for themselves and their Huns master or not, it was certainly not the Huns who went hungry. It was this sort of food collection that allowed the Huns to concentrate larger armies now than ever before. Some of the subjects, however, continued to be ruled directly by their own native kings or chiefs, who did the works of the leaders who ranked directly under Attila. Among them there were also those whom Attila favored, like Ardaric the king of Gepids, and Valamir the senior king of the Ostrogoths, who were as equals of the leaders under Attila. Attila had all the leaders under him, only because he could reward them all. We find these leaders owning and receiving expensive gifts, such as silks and Indian pearls, gold and silver, and many more. Gifts, tributes, and plunders were not the only sources from which these leaders got their luxuries. Let us talk about one more source of luxuries for these nomads, that is trade. Scholars have agreed that a nomadic society existing exclusively on their herds and cattle, and no contact with settled agricultural communities, is only a theoretical concept. Exchange with settled populations was essential for these nomads' existence. Their internal trade was of no importance, because they had nothing to offer to each other. There were many articles that were imported, and the weapons were among one of them. Weapons were imported on a large scale to the Hunnic dominion. Although they had their own weapons, it was almost impossible to go to war without the assistance of imported weapons. These nomads always lacked sufficient time and technique to make their own weapons. Even if they managed to get time and the technique, they were lacking the raw materials required. In return for these items, the Huns will have given what the steppe nomads have always been able to supply to settled agricultural societies, that is horses, meat, furs, and slaves. By the time of Attila, these exotic articles from the Roman world had become a common commodity, so much so that the leaders of high ranks had begun to look for luxurious items from outside the range of steppe people to make themselves distinguished from the common Hun folks. The growth of wealth has thus split the Hun society between the greater and the lesser people. The East Romans had obtained a monopoly of trade with the Huns, and this trade existed on a vast scale. The great bulk of coins sent out by Theodosius must have come back to the empire by way of trade. To many Roman subjects, this trade link was essential for their prosperity. This trade was very important for the Huns, and they knew it well. Since over and over again, they had forced the Romans to provide markets for the Huns. Ammianus described the women of early Huns as living in the wagons that formed the headquarters of the various groups of nomads. In these wagons, he says, that they spent their time stitching together the crude garments worn by their men, and in bearing their children. It suggests a very desperate hard condition of life, which was usually common in primitive nomadic societies. But this was not the case for the women at the time of Attila. The actions of women when Priscus visited Attila does not suggest this sort of seclusion of the women. Priscus writes that Attila accepted the gifts while still sitting on his horse, because he wished to please the wife of his lieutenant. One of the villages through which Priscus and his company passed through was actually ruled by a woman, a wife of Bleda. The growth of wealth and the influx of money had thus not yet radically downgraded the position of women in the Hun society. This is it for this video. If you've enjoyed this, then please like this video and subscribe to this channel for more such content. And thanks for watching.